Very much indeed. Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you very much indeed for coming to hear about this. I'm going to try and tell you about a number of things today, not just about MapAction, but about natural disasters, about what happens when natural disasters occur. And because I am by profession a geologist and have spent 40 years developing applications of remote sensing in the earth sciences, I'm going to slip in a little bit of information, highly technical information, about some of the things the latest things that remote sensing can do in the event of certain natural hazards. So I don't know who's going to tell me what we're looking at here, but it's pretty clearly a desperate situation. Any guesses? I think so. So it's very difficult to understand the power that the forces of nature can unleash. And I'm told, in fact, that close up, when you first see a tsunami coming, it looks like a rather benign thing. But of course, it's actually a huge mass and a volume, and it creates total devastation. Therefore, when these disasters take place, there's a huge demand for humanitarian resources. Obviously, one of the purposes is to save lives, but quite often a disaster has taken place, many lives are lost, and we can only save a few lives afterwards. But there's a lot that can be done towards the alleviation of suffering, and there's a huge task in reconstruction. Natural disasters, on the whole, we regard as sudden onset features that occur quite rapidly and often without any warning at all, although, as you will now know, in the case of floods and typhoons, we're sometimes able to get a feel that things are about to happen. But we also have much more complex disasters, which, generally speaking, are conflict-related emergencies, but of course may be meteorologically related in the form of famine, water shortage. And the complex disasters are very much more difficult to deal with, but on the other hand, you have a longer time to deal with it. Sudden onset disasters, normally natural, require very rapid response. And that's what I'm going to tell you quite a bit about with MapAction. But also, of course, there's a need for disaster risk reduction. And in all of these things, it's the geospatial element that's so important. You all know now about geographical information systems, how we handle geographic data, and it becomes even more important when we're working in these fields. I will only speak very briefly about what happens in the humanitarian world, but it's important to understand that there is a sense of humanitarian coordination, starting with the government of the affected country, who will probably ask a UN agency, and the UN has agencies like OCHA that you can see on this list, and UNDAC, the Coordination of Humanitarian Affairs, and the Disaster Assessment and Coordination Group. And these are the people that rush into a disaster area, try to work out what's happened, try to find out what resources are needed, and start probably raising money and liaising with all the non-governmental organizations, the NGOs, such as the Red Cross, who are going to help bring in the resources and raise the money. And it's in this area of the NGOs that our small charity, MapAction, sits. There are very well-defined principles of humanitarianism, and there have to be, because sometimes these disasters, of course, are not naturally occurring, and they come about through conflict. And so a very strict code of conduct is absolutely crucial, and it's all about neutrality, humanitarianism, of course, impartiality, and independence, of course, from any kind of political or social faction. And sometimes, as a last resort, it also has to involve the military. And I think we're going to see increasing amounts of military involvement, both from our country and other countries in the future. So what happens when a disaster strikes? What are the characteristics? Well, you have sometimes a huge loss of life. You've got a very traumatized and disoriented population. There's probably no power, water, telecoms, internet. Your mobile phone doesn't work. You can't exchange information freely with other workers. There's probably no command and control to start with. There may be coordination. In fact, basically in a disaster, everything is a disaster, and it's an extremely challenging environment in which to work. This was the Pakistan earthquake. Helicopters flying around, some of them crash. They're trying to get supplies into remote areas. Winter's coming on. Many people have already died. Buildings have gone. There's no heating and there's no food. And you've got to try and work out what's the best thing to do and how you're going to do it. And you will have what we call an OSOC, an Operational Coordination Center, where it's absolute sheer mayhem, people crammed into tents or whatever kind of space they can find to try and coordinate the disaster response, try and get some power into this room, try and set up a computer network and start sharing information, very often spreadsheets, information about the location of where the schools are, and build maps. And that's where MapAction come in, although, to be quite honest, we don't entirely work with maps. We really handle information. It's a UK charity. It's totally independent. The original idea came out of the Bosnian crisis in 1997, and we became operational in 2003. Obviously, our principle is humanitarian relief. We would love to be able to say that we can save lives, but probably that doesn't happen very often. But what we can do is we can try to preserve life, and we can relieve the suffering and poverty that occurs. The way we run it is through, at the present, about 90 volunteers, all of whom are highly experienced GIS professionals. They've mostly got at least a master's degree in geographical information systems, having done first degrees in computer science or geoscience or geography. We have a full-time staff of 8 professional people who are experienced in the humanitarian world and run a central coordination depot so that when a disaster occurs, we can act. This costs about £700,000 a year, and we have to spend quite a lot of our time trying to raise that money. We do get some of it from the UK government. We get some from the Dutch government. Ironically, we don't get anything from the United Nations. And we supply this information that I'm going to show you pretty much free at the point of delivery at the disaster site. We have all sorts of different types of missions, and sometimes people do pay us to go and provide information, but mostly our principle is we get there very often before the United Nations on the ground, and we do the work on the ground. And that's the crucial factor, because there are lots of people who have geographical information skills sitting in this campus, I'm sure, and in many other universities around the world, and they can do a huge amount of data processing, but there's no substitute for being on the spot, creating the products that are actually required and communicating the information to the UN leaders and the government leaders who are at that command and control center. This is where we fit into the disaster cycle, and I expect you're now getting to understand this. You know that you will get an event or an emergency, but there's a whole sequence of events that follow afterwards, from rescue, relief, then you move into a rehabilitation, reconstruction phase, and then you start to think about how you can try to stop it happening again. Well, our primary role is to go in right at the beginning of a disaster, but because disasters happily don't happen all the time and they can be quite infrequent, last year we responded to only 9, the year before 14, then we're able to spend some of our volunteers' time working on preparedness, that is, building data sets for areas where we think disasters may occur in the future. For example, we would know that there is at some point going to be major flooding in the Zambezi catchment, so we try to build up all the information we can about that part of Africa so that we're ready to move when this occurs. What we do is to get on the ground as quickly as we can. Our volunteers will, as you'll see in a moment, seek leave of absence from their jobs. They all have agreements with their employers that let them go away for a couple of weeks of unpaid, sometimes paid leave. We'll send round text messages, very quickly assemble a team. We will probably have been invited either by the host government or by the United Nations. We'll get people on the ground. They may have to camp. They might be in a 5-star hotel. Can't tell. And they will start building a common operational picture and what we call a 3W map, which is a who, what, where map. And we will distribute these maps to the relief agencies, to the government bodies, from our little kiosk, mostly as hard copy, but increasingly people will come up to our kiosk and get the information digitally. And our customers include all the people who are at the site of the disaster, but also all around the world, because of course we put this information on the web if we can. Must get the hang of which way to turn this knob. Oh, there we go. So who, what, where is the most important thing. Which people have been affected? What's happened to them? Where are they? And where has it been? What's happened to the critical infrastructure? Are the bridges there? Are the roads passable? Are the power lines still there? Is there any mobile phone communication? Is there power to the phone masts? And then what are the continuing hazards? If there's been heavy rainfall, have we got roads that are impassable or roads that could become more dangerous next time it rains, as you see with mudslides like this? So trying to build up a picture of how the relief agencies can move around and then mapping out what resources there are, where the airstrips are, where the schools are, which is particularly important because that's a focal point where people gather, where the hospitals are. Are the hospitals still there? Have they been, suffered damage in an earthquake or taken away by the effects of something like a tsunami? That's what we're trying to do. And so, like you, we would be watching the news, we would be looking at websites. Suddenly, you'll hear there's an earthquake. Just last year, I heard my phone go off with the USGS message that there's been a level 7 or above earthquake. It was 5 or 6 o'clock in the morning, and I thought, shall I go and see where it is, or shan't I? And I didn't, and about 7 o'clock, I couldn't resist it anymore, and I went downstairs to find that it was Kathmandu, where my daughter was working in an NGO. So you never know what's going to happen next. As soon as we get that information at MapAction, we try to mobilize a team. Messages go around, people call in with their availability. We'll select as quickly as we can 2 or 3 people to get on a plane within hours. And meanwhile, other members of the team will start collating the base map data for the area. We've no idea where it might be. It could be in Peru, it could be in Cambodia. We may have the data in our archives. We may have to start ringing round. We might go to the Ministry of Defence. We'll scour the internet. We'll try to gather all the information that we can and assemble it in a form so that within 24 hours we've got it to a point where the people who've arrived in the field can ingest it in some way. Sometimes we'll send them off with data sticks or even Google Earth data, which in the few hours that we have between them being called up and getting on the plane, we'll get it onto a DVD for them, and off they go. They'll arrive in the support base, unpack their equipment, and start trying to pull together the information and liaise with locals on the ground. They'll try to understand the requirements that the relief agencies are going to have, and they'll produce layers of data. So very often the information we get is not a map, but it'll be a spreadsheet giving us the coordinates of every settlement in the country, the location of every hospital. And we will feed that, we will assemble all that information into a form where it can be in a common data register that can be used in GIS systems, either something like ArcView or more likely QGIS, which is open source. If necessary, our staff will then go out with the UN teams on the ground with GPS, maybe by helicopter, maybe in vehicles, and we'll start gathering information or getting people to bring information back to us. So we'll send them off with a smartphone, and they'll take geotagged pictures of all the bridges that have suffered damage. They'll bring that back to us. Somebody will put that into a spreadsheet, and it will end up on a map. We'll then produce these maps and upload them to online platforms. Now, this online may or may not be on net. So when we say online, it may just be within the OSOC itself, within the Operations Control Center, or it may be that we've actually got internet access and we can feed the maps, first of all, back to our servers in the UK and then out to other users. But we also, there's a desperate need for printed hard copy. People who work on the ground in hot countries, you know, it's either pouring with rain or there's bright sunlight, and all the computer tools in the world aren't nearly as effective as a bit of paper that you can put information on. So to scramble our team, we have a headquarters based northwest of London, not so far from Heathrow, where we keep all the kit. We've got an ex-army quartermaster who stores everything and records the digits of every single piece of equipment. It all gets boxed up, whatever's necessary, and here's one of our teams arriving in country. So they've arrived in a country where 100 miles away there may be nothing at all. In this particular case, they're in Manila. Manila's fine, but 100 miles up country, the typhoon has swept through and taken out a swathe about 100 kilometers wide. Those boxes contain network gear, laptops, portable A3 printers, satellite phones, small satellite receiving stations. They've got their tents with them if they have to, which in fact they're probably going to stay in this hotel, but you never know what's going to happen next. So there's a typical mobilized team. These people are highly trained. We have 80 volunteers at the moment. We expect to have 110 by the end of next year. We recently recruited a new intake of 10 volunteers. We had 110 applicants for the 10 places. So these are people who know a very great deal about geographical information systems and information processing already. We have 10 training weekends a year, and the volunteers have to come to at least 7 of them. They practice their GIS skills, and we practice common ways of working and common ways of assembling our data sets, because these volunteers never know who they're going to meet up with next in the field. But through the training weekends, we've built a kind of family relationship so that everybody knows everybody else. And it may not be until you get to the airport that you know who you're going to be working with and who's going to be doing what. And there are lots of other things that you have to be able to do. You have to be able to network your laptops together, hook in your printers, build your own pseudo-internet, which I'll explain later. And all of this is covered by standard operating procedures. These are lists of instructions where we have a step-by-step guide so that everything is done the same way and people can work together interoperably every time they get there. But of course, before they can even do that, they have to know how to operate in a harsh environment. They have to be medically prepared. Every volunteer is jabbed up all the time so that they could go to any part of the world. And they have first aid, medical training. They know how to get out of a damaged building. They know how to get people out of a damaged building. And they know how to behave in extreme circumstances. They know how to behave if they're kidnapped or held to ransom. This does happen. So this is not, these environments are not places that are easy to operate in or ready for visits by the unwary. So this is the sort of thing we would do at training, where we would actually set up a simulated operations control center, network all our computers together, check them over. The computers are kept permanently on and permanently updated at HQ so that we can take any one machine and it will be identical to the next one, have the same suite of software on it, and have all the IP addresses and all those complicated things that you need. So this is typically how people might spend 7 weekends a year. But they have fun and they enjoy themselves, and there's a real family atmosphere when we do this. And of course, these operations and control centers don't always look like that. They may well end up looking like this. This is in Haiti. It's in a tent. It's incredibly hot. You know, you're pouring with sweat all the time, and it's raining probably. Rats running around. The training covers all sorts of things. Here we are learning how to operate in an area that may have landmines, because we do get drawn into conflicts that, or we do get drawn into disasters that are conflict generated. And there are all sorts of things that you need to know about how to behave. And one of the things that is crucially important is, if we want to get relief into these areas, we need to understand how it is that not us, but other people are going to go about removing some of the traps and mines and other things that sit in the way. So what do we produce on the ground? Well, the topics, the maps that we produce obviously have to be tailored to the requirements of the specific emergency. And so no two emergencies come up with identical products, although we do try to standardize them. You might think that satellite imagery, and I particularly would like to think that satellite imagery would be very useful, because it's been my background for the last 40 years. Having said that, it very rarely is of much use, and we very rarely get relevant satellite pictures within a time frame that we're able to use them. There are exceptions, and specifically meteorological satellite data in the event of typhoons helps us understand that we need to go. In the last Philippines typhoon, we were actually in Manila before the typhoon made landfall. We knew it was going to come, and it was a good job that we were there. Radar imagery, as you may not know much about yet, but it does have a very useful purpose in flooded areas, and it sees through cloud cover. So normally, for some reason, when disasters happen, the weather's pretty bad, and that's another reason why we don't have very good satellite pictures. But radar gets around that, and we now have radar images which have pretty much an equivalent resolution to the highest resolution satellite images of around 0.5 meter. So we can see things like building damage if we manage to get the data. We've already talked about delivering the results. People don't want to see, well, actually, people love looking at satellite images, but that's not the satellite image we want to show them. We want to show them the derived data. They want a very simple map, and we need to be in a position to update it frequently. So typically, this is the first sort of thing they will want, a situation overview. Not even a map, really. You could do something like this in PowerPoint, and in fact, we do this in PowerPoint. This is to explain to people coming in what on earth has gone on. You are here, they are there, this is the issue, we've got 179 deaths, what are we going to do about it? We've got 260,000 people billeted out, we've got 40,000 that still need shelter. Red Cross, can you come up with shelter for 40,000 people? How quickly can you do it? So these situation overviews are very often the immediate starting point. And then there's a more detailed type of mapping where statistics really become important. So who's been affected, what's happened to them, and where are they? And in order to create maps like this, we don't rely on information coming in from the field. It won't come in sufficient accuracy. We have to rely on pre-existing maps that show things like population density, population centers, and very often there's conjecture about really how many people there are there, how many will have moved already. You have to make the best chance you can, and you have to get those statistics often from national governments, and often from national governments who don't have the level of sophistication of this kind of information that you would find in some of the other parts of the world that you might be used to, which is again a reason why, if we suspect that disasters may be coming up in particular areas, it behoves us to try and start gathering the information beforehand. There are now certain levels of global databases, but they're very general, and what we really need is country-level detailed information. And then we can start to think about what's actually happened. I mean, we must be here looking at flooding, I imagine. This is the problem here is what is the logistical range of our helicopters? Where are the affected areas? Where do we have to get our helicopters to? Where do we have to get the supplies to? How far can we go? And for example, we have to understand something about helicopters. So we have training in how helicopters operate. You may think helicopters go up and down, and in fact they don't. They land just like aircraft and they take off like aircraft. So we need to have digital elevation models which we can feed into the process to provide the helicopter pilots with targets where they may be able to get to. There's all sorts of things like this which need a level of understanding that isn't always found amongst every practitioner. We may be in a different situation. I think you may also, by now, know why it is that people seem to like living in very dangerous and it might seem rather stupid areas, like around volcanoes, but they do. And when things happen in volcanoes, then you have to get them out. And so you need maps which will help you plan how you're going to do that, especially if you've got a rapidly developing situation. Road access can be very complicated. You've got a flooded area, which roads are passable, which roads aren't passable. How do you get that information? We sometimes have the opportunity to send out helicopters. We are starting to use things like drones, not ourselves, but we rely on other NGOs who have these drones. They started out themselves looking a little bit like helicopters, but they've now grown into aeroplanes, you know, perhaps 4 or 5 meters across that you can throw up in the air, and they'll actually fly along a road and send you back or bring you back video, which you can then transcribe into a map and hand that map to the driver and say, when you get there, you're going to be in trouble. You've got to find another way around, and so on. Quite a lot of what one's doing is trying to zone an area out into different levels of intensity. How intensely affected is an area, whether it's by flooding or whether it's by earthquakes, or indeed sometimes whether it's going to be susceptible to further events like continuing rain. Can we produce a map which is likely to show where we're going to see more landslips? Can we use that to help plan our logistical operations, make sure that our logistical vehicles don't get trapped on the wrong side of areas that may turn worse? Looking very directly at something like the Haiti earthquake, one of the key factors is helping the search and rescue teams. We have to break up the city into small areas that can be conveniently worked on by an individual search and rescue party. Here there might have been 10 or 15 search and rescue parties, all coming from different parts of the world, bringing with them, of course, their dogs, and we try to break the city up into small areas. The only problem was there was no street map of Port-au-Prince when the earthquake took place. There simply wasn't a published map. You couldn't buy one. The best thing you could find was a sort of sketch map in the rough guide. So what happened is that over a long weekend, a lot of people around the world hacked together effectively a open street map of Port-au-Prince and the surrounding areas. We got a copy of that and we used it to create the SAR sector map here, which is how we broke the area up into the search and rescue teams. Another very different kind of disaster, but very similar in a way, is the munitions explosion in Brazzaville in the Congo. So here, a huge depot of munitions blew up, made a crater hundreds of meters across, but out of it blue a lot of munitions that hadn't exploded, and they were spread all around the city, everywhere. And the city was completely impassable. Many people were killed, and we had to use, in this case, a radar image to produce a street map that would allow us to work out where the search and rescue sectors were, dispatch the teams who were going to go through every building looking for these unexploded munitions, and of course some of the people as well, and eventually try and reach a point where the city was safe and they could start thinking about rebuilding. And then of course we come to other types of things, and here specifically the Ebola crisis, another very difficult environment in which to work, but another area where geospatial data is critically important in getting to the root cause of the problem, and critically important in any attempt to try and alleviate it. And so our teams were out there in several different locations, creating maps which would, for example, show the frequency of occurrence of Ebola deaths, where the concentrations of population were, where people were likely to be moving, because it was the transmigration of people that had a huge impact on the difficulty with which it was possible to stop the event. And also, of course, things like where the clinics were, where you could get tests done, what the travel distance was to get from one community to another in order to get a test done to find out what was happening and so on. So the geospatial component was crucially important. And you may also recall that the UK military came in on this event too. So here was a very good example of civil military cooperation in a disaster zone where the role of geospatial information was absolutely critical. Just to give you an idea of the disasters that we've responded to since 2003, over 50. You can see how the color coding goes. So some of them are in green, famine, food crisis, red, seismically related, either tsunami or earthquake, blue, floods, and then unusual things like Ebola. And you can see also the range of countries that we've been to. So it can be all over the place. It is worth saying that there are certain countries that we wouldn't expect to go to. I can't imagine us working in the United States. Russia would never invite foreigners to help, I suspect, and China is much the same. And there are countries who are deeply suspicious of having foreign entities coming to help them, and especially foreign entities who make maps. So there are all sorts of political issues. We are fraught with concern over some of the places that we want to go to, and some of the places that we want to go and help because we're trying to help people, but some of them are conflict zones, and the people are in trouble because there's a conflict on. So you're not only putting yourself into that conflict, you may appear to be taking sides in it, which we're not. You may appear, or you may be very close to getting caught up in it. So it's an extremely difficult path to tread. But this will anyway give you an indication of some of the things that go on around the world where an international response becomes absolutely critical. These are, in fact, almost all the major events that have taken place in this time where there's been a really significant major response. And we've been very lucky in that right in the very early days, and specifically in the Southeast Asian tsunami, people recognized the value of what we were doing. And ever since then, the United Nations have, without fail, asked us to join their teams. Now, if they didn't do that, we would have very great difficulty getting into many of these countries. Some of them, you could simply go as a tourist, and you could, if you like, as a tourist, but you could get in and start your work. But most of them, you would only really get close to what was going on if the United Nations had said, would you please come and support us in our operations control center? So we've reached a very privileged status very quickly, and that seems to be continuing. I thought I would talk a little bit about Kathmandu. not so much from what MapAction did, although I will tell you that, but because I'm personally very interested in anything to do with geoscience, and spent about 10 years towards the end of my activity developing commercial applications in radar interferometry for measuring small amounts of ground movement. So what MapAction was doing in Nepal was trying to do things like map the number of reported deaths. And here you can see by, in this case, sort of prefectures, local government areas, the number of deaths that have been reported as a result of the earthquake. And you get a fairly clear picture fairly quickly as to what was going on. Doesn't tell you how many buildings are damaged, doesn't tell you anything else, but this is the sort of information that's needed as quickly as possible. And you know, we would have probably got this from one of the Nepalese ministries, who would have received phone messages from their district governors reporting what had happened in their areas. And the numbers are obviously only approximate. But I'd like to show you something like this, which may appear rather obscure to many of you. This is what we call radar interferometry. And what it's doing is using satellite radar images, two satellite radar images. And instead of looking at the reflectance properties of the radar image, it's looking at the phase component of the signal. So normally with optical images, we can't look into the phase, but with radar we can, because we are artificially illuminating the ground with microwave, so we know all about the physics of that signal, and we know about the physics of its return. And as a result, we can look at how those signals change from, from one image to another. So if we take an image from before the earthquake and an image from after the earthquake, we find that there are differences in the phase component of the signal due to tiny ground movements that have taken place. This is, in a way, rather like a policeman's speed camera. He's looking at the return signals from your speeding car, and by measuring the changes in the phase component, he can tell what speed you're moving at. By looking at the phase changes on these images, we can see how much the ground has moved in the course of this event. And I can transfer that into something that's easier for you to understand, because here you can see up to a meter of uplift in the immediate area, slightly to the northwest of, northeast of Kathmandu. And then further north, you can see that the ground has actually gone down by about, relatively speaking, by about half a meter. And you can get a pretty good feel for the orientation of the fault that we're talking about. Now, this is quite remarkable, actually, that we can do something like this. And I'm not going to try and describe it now, but I wanted to show it to you because I want you to go away and ask about it in the future if you don't get taught about it. Because this sort of approach is very much the future of what we may be able to do and that we may be able to apply in, I wouldn't say predicting earthquakes, but getting a better understanding of when and possibly more specifically where they may occur, and thereby feeding that information into our understanding of risk. And possibly even more interesting than this particular image is this one, which is showing you the results of another interferogram, another pair of images, or, well, one of the images will have been the image before the earthquake, but the second image will have been an image that was taken after the aftershock occurred. And what you can see here is that the aftershock was movement that lay quite a bit further to the east of where the main deformation that you saw earlier was. Furthermore, there is actually a gap between the deformation that we see here and the deformation that we saw on the main interferogram. That means there's an area where the fault hasn't moved, and there are 2 areas where the fault has moved. So it's telling you that things possibly still haven't resolved themselves in this area. I don't want to go into it in any more detail than that, except to say that I think this is one of the most exciting techniques. We can apply it in all sorts of ways. We can also look at volcanoes. So you know, or you may know, or you hopefully will soon be knowing, that volcanoes can be monitored in all sorts of ways. We have seismic monitoring. We have geochemical monitoring that will record what's bubbling out of a volcano in terms of the emitted gases. But now we have a way of actually seeing tiny, tiny movements on the surface of the volcano, which may even be more sensitive than some of the seismic effects. So by taking before and after radar images of volcanoes, we've got a way of looking at them remotely that may help us further predict when we may have volcanic hazards occurring. And just to show you how incredibly sensitive this is, we're looking at an area of the United States. It's an interferogram, so these are effectively like Newton's rings. If you've ever seen Newton's rings, when you lay a thin film of plastic on a piece of glass, that's the interference of the light that's being refracted between the plastic and the glass due to very slight differences in the spacing between the plastic and the glass. We are effectively using the same phenomenon here to represent what's happening with 2 radar images. So these are sinkholes in the Permian Basin of the United States, and you can see the outline of the sinkholes in bold, but all around them there are areas where the ground has subsided slightly, subsided by very often just a few millimeters, so little that you wouldn't be able to measure it with existing survey techniques. Existing survey techniques are not very good at measuring very small elevation changes. And then down here, we have an area where there is surface movement taking place, but so far we haven't found a sinkhole. That's quite useful information. Quite useful information in areas like this where there is local infrastructure, where people are probably going to undertake development. So these are, I think, very important tools that will play a significant role in the future in our understanding of geohazards. We're really only just starting to get to grips with them now. And unfortunately, they don't really play a significant role at the moment in the sorts of things that we have to do when disasters strike, when MapAction get called in. So I'll move on now and just show you a couple more examples. For example, here we are in the Philippines, and what you can see is the passage of the storm across and breaking the area down into its regional prefectures. We can rank the severity of the damage based on the information that's come back from the local governors. This is the information that, first of all, the national government wants, but most importantly, the UN wants, and Save the Children, Red Cross, CAFOD want to work out where they've got to get crucial supplies, both medical supplies, may even be something as fundamental as water, because unless you've collected clear rainwater, your existing water supplies are probably no longer useful here. And then, of course, the focus for where the building materials can go. In many respects, it's lucky that we're dealing with an island archipelago here, and we've got marine transportation possibilities, because a lot of the onshore transportation will have been severely compromised by the storm damage. So, having explained that we call ourselves MapAction, we do produce maps. I believe that we're possibly ought to be calling ourselves InfoAction, really, because what it's about is information, and maps are a means of presenting information, and increasingly we are working with data that's not even map derived, and we're turning it into something which can be understood. And there is always a need to have a poster, a map, something that you can point at, show what's gone on. But you will know much better than I that increasingly people want this kind of data in other forms. And producing maps like this is a very difficult thing to do. We're obviously lucky in this particular environment because we're in an operations center where there are big printers and computers are working, but sometimes we're going to find ourselves in places where that doesn't operate. So geodata sharing is a critical factor in all of this, because there's no point in creating this information if you can't share it, move it around to the actors who need to work with it. That can be very difficult. So you find yourself in a field environment where there's no internet. You can make you may be dependent upon small generators to charge your tablets and your phones, and people want to have the information on their tablets and phones. So we've set up our own kiosk system, which will allow us to pass that information around even if there's no phone network and even if there's no internet. So those of you will be much more familiar, you'll be much more familiar with how all these devices work than I am, but you will also know that if you have no internet, iPhones and iPads can't connect to a network that's not internet connected. You have to trick them. Apple have this wonderful policy of wanting to know what you're doing all the time, and therefore you really can't get anywhere unless you've been to California first. We've worked out a way how to get around this so that we can put our own router into an operations control center, and people can come in and download our maps straight onto their own devices, and we provide them with basic tools that allow them to edit the maps for their own purposes, to present the information to their bosses or the government or the minister to explain what it is that's needed and what the problems are going to be. I think I've given you a clear picture of that, but these are the sorts of challenges which 5 years ago we didn't think about, and now we realize that we're becoming, if you like, information technology brokers in crisis environment. Lots of things I haven't talked about, but I would like to mention because I think it's important to understand in the context. We have to have very, very rigorous data standards because we're exchanging geographic data with lots of people. As you get more into what you're doing, I'm sure you'll become involved more with geographical information systems, and you will understand that the difficulties of dealing with disparate data types. The sources of our information are very tricky. In some countries that we go to, all maps are regarded as classified information, and there can be a huge amount of sensitivity over what we put on our maps. Lots of governments either don't want to admit that there's certain problems, or they actually want to portray some of the problems as being worse than they are because it's their opportunity to get funds from donors to try to alleviate them. And some of the data that we use, the sources are very complicated. They may be military, they may be commercial sources, which we have been allowed to use, but we then need to publish. So not only do our folks have to know all about GIS, but they have to know all about all the issues of sensitivity, copyright, confidentiality. And before we even start going on some of these missions, we have to think about how we're going to get away again. So part of my role as one of the trustees is actually to make sure that before we dash off somewhere, we've thought about how we're going to get back, and how we're going to leave behind us not a vacuum, but some sort of a legacy that our work can be continued. Because there's not a lot of point in going out there, doing all this work, and then shutting up shop and going away again, because the relief operation will continue, and it will continue for some time. So it's not just a question of grabbing a suitcase and dashing off and seeing what you can do, but it's a much longer, thought-through process. And even when the mission is over, we have to get home and then think about what's going to happen next. What have we learnt? What do we need to know should another disaster happen in that area? What lessons have we learnt that we can apply to the next disaster in some other country? All I can say is that this has been a very, very successful operation. I was involved right at the very beginning, trying to provide some advice. Some of the first volunteers were actually members of my staff, but I wasn't able to take such a direct role in this when I was running my own business. When I sold my business, I've then taken over and gradually actually become the chairman of the organization. But the proof of the pudding is in the eating, and these are the people who are doing the eating. And if the UN want us to go, they want us to be a part of their operation, then we know that we've got some of it right. And none of us wants these terrible disasters to happen, but they will, and there may be one starting right now for all I know. There may not be another one for 6 months or a year. I haven't ever seen more than 6 months go by without a major disaster, and I hope there's some inspiration for you here to better understand what our Earth's natural hazards are, and maybe play a role in some stage in either how on earth we can do something to alleviate them, or indeed get involved in something like this, which is, believe me, a very worthwhile thing when you can turn your technical skills and the knowledge that you've developed, might be in 10 years' time, you've hopefully had a career out of it, but you might also feel that it's an opportunity to use that experience to put something back to people who definitely disadvantaged by what nature has thrown at them. So thank you very much, and I'm very happy to talk about any of this if anybody wants to ask me any questions.